A debt crisis is emerging in the global south at the precise moment when substantial investments is needed to meet shared climate and development goals. While debt relief, debt restructuring, and debt forgiveness have dominated conversations around the continent for the past few years, there seems to have been barely any real improvement when it comes to the continent's debt situation. Even something as widely touted as the G20 Common Framework has been unable to engage all creditor classes or even link debt relief to climate and development. African countries are particularly grappling with the complex issue of how to rearrange their debts in light of the severe global economic downturn. A recent Boston University report found that with 25% of emerging markets and 60% of low-income countries, including in Africa, in or near debt distress, up to $520 billion needs to be written off by richer countries. Joining me now is one of the authors of that report, Dr. Rishikesh Ram Bhandari, Assistant Director of the Global Economic Governance Initiative at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. His research focuses on how developing countries mobilize finance from different international sources. Dr. Bhandari, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So I want to sort of lay a foundation for this conversation, and particularly with how dire seem to be for many African economies at this point in time. So what has led so many countries on the continent to making requests for emergency bailouts, forcing talks with lenders, even talking about debt distress, and in some very extreme case, we've seen debt defaults? How have we found ourselves back here with so much of the prosperity that the continent had made in the past 20 or so years?
So first of all, we have to remember that the debt levels were already increasing even before the pandemic actually hit. Now, the impact of the pandemic has been severe, of course, as you're well aware, and countries are also witnessing far lower than expected economic growth rates. Now, to add another major shock to the system has been Russia's war in Ukraine, and that has led to high energy prices, high food prices, and of course inflation has gone up, and countries have increased their interest rates in order to combat inflation, which has remained pretty stubbornly persistent. What this means is that countries are now paying a larger fraction of their revenue paying down their debt, and that means that they have less cash available on hand to pay for more productive investments that would help them reboost their economic growth rates. And so when you look at the situation altogether, you can see how countries would be increasingly in a situation where they're facing debt distress.
So let's look at what the figures give us at this point in time, because I think it's also interesting we talk about that. So emerging markets and developing economies, external debt levels and service payments have now more than doubled. So between 2008 and 2021, EMDE sovereign debt increased by 178%. So that's from 1.4 trillion to about $3.9 trillion right now. So looking at the situation for African countries, particularly, we know there's an infrastructure deficits. We know that there are gaps in many things, and those are what the loans are meant to be filling the gaps for. So let's look at that as part of this conversation. Were taking of any of these loans particularly avoidable for some of these African economies? We can use Kenya as an example. We can use Nigeria as an example. We can use Ghana as an example. Zambia as well. We've seen the situation with them. And have these loans really been put to the best use? Have they been fully maximized and utilized and found a way to pay back for themselves?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. So I think, we have to first of all keep in mind that, as you just said, countries have very immense infrastructure investment needs. And, one recent study estimated that countries need around $2.4 trillion by 2030 in order to meet their climate change and development goals. So it's, not surprising at all that countries would want to borrow so heavily. But I think what the situation suggests is that the options available to countries to meet their infrastructure needs are actually not that great in terms of the terms and the various types of contracts that are actually available. And so what we've seen over the last decade, particularly by many African countries that have been able to access international markets for the first time, is that the costs are very high, the terms are very short, And to me, what this suggests is that there has to be a greater set of options available to countries so that they can access resources at concessional rates, and at sort of a longer, at a much longer duration, so that they're able to make sure that they're able to pay these loans back on time. And therefore, the role of multilateral development banks is particularly critical in this regard because they have the capacity to offer countries those low cost and long duration loans.
All right, so we have the loans in place. We have people that African economies owe these loans to. So let's talk about creditors right now and some of the attempts. So after the COVID-19 pandemic, the G20 Common Framework came about, but it seems to have achieved very little. Only 3 countries, Chad, Ethiopia, and Zambia, have applied for debt treatment under the CF, and none has actually accomplished debt restructuring. But we also heard that Ghana is in the works of applying as well. One of the main issues with the framework has been the failure to engage all creditor classes. Basically, it's failed to bring all the creditors to the table. So Dr. Bandari, let's look at this right now because we see it particularly with Zambia. It's been a prolonged situation. They're trying to reach out to all of the creditors, but everybody is not willing to come to the table. Why is that?
So, first of all, the creditor landscape, right, in terms of who really needs to be at the table, that looks very starkly different than it did in the 80s and the 90s. There's a much larger set of actors who really need to be brought to the table, and that means coordination has become a lot more challenging than just a few decades ago. And this problem, in particular, in terms of the coordination problem, is especially acute because you have a growing prominence of private creditors, for example, bondholders, and that makes it challenging to coordinate across creditor classes. Now, the G20's Common Framework is also not equipped fully with the instruments that it would need to be able to offer carrots and sticks to bring all creditor classes to the table. Now, what we also have to remember is that the machinery for debt resolution that currently exists was created for a very different time. And so what we're seeing is the G20 trying to come up with a solution that isn't fully there yet to really meet the need of the moment, to make sure that the international architecture really has the design that is really demanded by the situation right now.
So I want to stay with the G20 Common Framework because there's a link as well to the debt conversation with the climate and development conversation. And for some people, it would be difficult. We're not even out of the debts, but we're also talking about now investing and financing climate development and climate change. And you found that climate vulnerability is actually correlating with lower sovereign borrowing space and high debt service payments against exports. So can you sort of take us through this and make the link for us? Because we are many climate vulnerable countries here on the African continent who are also focusing and struggling with their debt burdens right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's I think a very important point. And I think one of the starting points is that for many climate vulnerable countries, the cost of borrowing is really high. And what that means is that they are not able to invest in building resilience to make sure that the impacts of climate change can actually be minimal. And so when countries do borrow, they face higher costs, and that means they're having to pay a larger fraction than they ordinarily would. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is that once countries get hit by extreme events, of course, debt will naturally pile up. Now, the international architecture, particularly the way in which lending contracts are currently designed, does not really give countries a lot of relief to postpone their payments. There have been some discussions about this in terms of inserting natural disaster relief clauses, but this is still at a pretty initial stage, and it needs to be scaled up very broadly. And so you have a situation where debt will pile up following natural disasters, which again further erodes the fiscal space that countries have to make those productive investments that they really need. We've also found that climate vulnerable countries are far more likely to go to the IMF, that is to have IMF programs, than other countries. Now, what we also have to remember is that climate vulnerable countries are already facing climate-induced losses. This is not a hypothetical thing that may happen in the future. but there are estimates out there that already suggest that climate vulnerable countries are already suffering major economic climate-induced losses already.
So let's talk about the elephant in the room, which happens to be China. And you mentioned, of course, how the creditor landscape has changed in the past decade or so. And China's arrival on that landscape has really led to a lot of changes. It's become the lender of last resort for many African countries. And if we're going to talk about debts, restructuring, sustainability in any form, China has to be part of this equation. In terms of what we should expect, what should be demanded of China when it comes to African countries' debt, forgiveness, sustainability, restructuring, whatever it may be, what should those expectations be?
Now, first of all, I think the situation is not just of, one elephant in the room, but actually quite a few. And that is precisely why we are, seeing the problems that we are seeing in terms of the inability or the lack of effectiveness in coordinating across creditor classes through the G20's Common Framework. And so, what we need is a robust mechanism that is equipped with the incentives, both carrots as well as the sticks, so that all creditor classes, right, the Chinese, the private bondholders, the other creditors, the Paris Club, all of these creditors can come to the table and to make sure that countries are receiving the debt relief that they really need to. So this really has to be a collective effort that brings together all creditor classes. Now, the other part of this is that we have to remember, Chinese finance has filled a very major important gap in terms of what countries have for their infrastructure investments and beyond. So again, this is another situation where the Chinese by themselves will not be able to fill all of the investment needs that are required, right? So therefore, again, there is a need to think about the diversity of options, the diversity of terms and conditions offered to make sure that countries really have the best possible choices to meet their infrastructure needs.
Okay, so let's take a trip maybe down history lane or memory lane, as they say. So, because history shows us that when sovereign debt becomes unsustainable, eventually we see restructuring. And we saw that with Nigeria, with the Paris Club, and we're not the only African country that's done that. But we also know that much time tends to pass before this measure of last resort is taken. And the Global Development Policy Center, you've argued that there must be an overhaul of the finances of emerging countries, including debt restructuring, as well as write-offs, and even in some cases, suspension. So let's put some figures to this conversation now. How much are we talking about? What are we looking at here, Dr. Bandari?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So first of all, what we did was we created a list, based on the IMF and based on what UNDP came up with in terms of which countries really need attention. And so, based on that sample of 69 countries for whom only 61 countries actually had available data. And so we were able to do the estimates for these 61 countries. And what we found was that these countries, to achieve that sustainability, would need more than 812 billion in debt that needs to be restructured across all creditor classes. And we looked at two different scenarios. One, which is, as you say, going back to history, what does the HIPC era level haircut look like? And what does the historical average in terms of more bilateral deals, what does that look like? So we looked at debt relief, in terms of these two scenarios. And what we found is that in one scenario, there's $317 billion, and in the other scenario, which is higher, is $520 billion in debt relief. And now, debt relief is only one portion of the proposal that we have outlined. We also have to remember that not all countries, immediately require debt relief, and so for those countries, ways to enhance their credit will be extremely important. Now, the other part of this proposal is that countries, or not countries, but private creditors and other commercial actors that need to be brought to the table should be receiving incentives in the form of carrots and sticks. And for that, we've been saying that there has to be a guarantee facility that would help swap out old debt, issue new debt backed by this guarantee facility. And we estimate that the size of that guarantee facility to be around $62 billion.
Wow.
If the total debt relief is in the higher end, around $520 billion. So yeah, those are the set of numbers.
So what is sort of the worst case scenario? Maybe worst case is too far, because I don't think there's a situation where we'd wait to see multiple African economies fall into debt default. But what is sort of some scenarios along the way that could be bad if we do not see attempts at restructuring, forgiveness, suspension really pick up speed in the coming years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what we are going to witness, right, is a very unfortunate situation in that, this decade is supposed to be the decade for accelerating mobilization of finance in achieving our climate change goals, in achieving our sustainable development goals. Now, instead, if countries are having to pay most of their revenue paying down old debt, we are going to be witnessing a development crisis unfold where these goals will be, largely unmet. And so the fear is that we will witness a lost decade of development when we really need to be doing the exact opposite, which is making sure we're investing in the necessary investments, particularly infrastructure needs, to be able to meet those climate change and development goals.
So how many countries are part of this 61 countries that you've identified as being in or at high risk of debt distress in terms of this research that we've seen?
Mm-hmm. So the 61 countries are at high risk of debt distress, right? Of those 61 countries, roughly half happen to be in Africa. Roughly
half. Oh, wow. All right. So, Dr. Bandari, before I let you go, I think the question then is, and you've been sort of spacing it throughout the answers you've given me today, is how do we move past this and how do we move through it right now? As you mentioned earlier, there's the Russia-Ukraine crisis. We're all still trying to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. We don't know what this year is going to bring after we've seen a year of record high inflation and interest rates. And it seems that the Federal Reserve might continue to raise interest rates again as it continues to fight inflation. What do we do to move through this and past this in the coming years?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So first of all, I think what we really need to reckon with is the fact that the G20 Common Framework has not been able to deliver the kind of debt relief that really needs to be delivered, and that it really needs reform. And so the first component of this is that there has to be comprehensive debt relief by public creditors, private creditors, as well as commercial creditors also need to come to the table, whether through characteristics. All creditor classes need to be compelled to come to the table so that they're able to make sure that countries are able to access the debt relief that they need to. Now, instead of this case-by-case approach that the G20 has, there has to be a far more systematic approach so that countries know exactly what the process is when they sign up to go to this framework. Now, one hesitation has been this uncertainty of what this process means, and therefore countries are hesitating to go seek debt relief when they probably actually really should. And so the final piece is to make sure that countries don't actually teeter over the edge. There has to be a far more scaled up mobilization of finance, of ways to enhance credit so that countries continue to remain able to access concessional resources to make the investments that they really need to.
And I know this is going to be an ongoing conversation. Your research will continue and our conversations will continue on this side as well. So I do look forward to having you join me again. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
All right. And my guest was Dr. Rishikesh Ram Bandari, Assistant Director of the Global Economic Governance Initiative at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. Research into how much needs to be written off, forgiven, restructured, puts the number at over $800 billion. And a large part of it needs to go to African economies, with 25% of emerging markets and 60% of low-income countries, including those in Africa, already at or near debt distress. You're watching Business Edge. When we come back, we have international business headlines for you. And from there, a conversation about debt, then a conversation about wealth. We'll have the details of the Africa Wealth Report 2023 after the news.